Hi investors, it's Nick Garner here from Investmore, and today we're going to talk about property calculations. It's a big topic. It's quite complicated, quite dry, quite necessary because, well, your money depends on it, and one that I've really gone down the rabbit hole with. So let's get into it. And the very first thing is I built this in Google Sheets, and there's a link below where you can take a copy of it if you want. And I have variables here for tax. And the reason I wanted to understand that is because it's just you should know where you're at. Like, how much money do you actually get out of a property if you factor in tax? Now, the thing with tax is it's very labyrinthine, and once you get deep into the weeds with it, it gets really complicated. So I've just taken it at a relatively high level, but I also needed to have these variables to factor in different types of stamp duty because there are different levels of stamp duty, should I say, depending on circumstance. And here's some links and so on, just talking about basically my sources on this. Now, the next thing is we have lots of variables and they derive a lot of the calculations. And the very first thing one would do is a critical variable is like, where is the property? Because we want to know what the capital growth is like. So in the variables section, I've got capital growth for every single postcode district in the UK, and that comes from my good friends, the property data people, who are very good. And with that in mind, so we input that, and then it's the type of property, and then it's target yield. And the reason it's 5.2% is because that seems to be an optimal yield for property that that from which you can get a 75% loan to value mortgage. And the reason that's significant is because there's a pressure test, and the pressure test is here, and it's basically an amount of interest, and then your rent has to be equivalent to 125% of the mortgage cost at a given interest rate. So it's 5.5%, 125%. So that's what that's all about. And that's why 5.2% is an important number. And let's say it's a nice property. So let's say it's going to get 825 a month, which I think is reasonable for a good 3-bed semi in a nice area. And in theory, one can bid higher on this property, but let's keep it at 160 because I think that's a realistic number for a good property deal. We talked about the stress tests and the LTV. So therefore, you're going to need to put down a £40,000 deposit to the bank, and you're going to be borrowing 120 on this property. And assuming it's a foreign national buy to let, 8,700 in stamp duty, and then you've got some fees. Then you've got our consulting fee, which is 2% of the purchase price. So your total cost so far is 53,000. But let's say it needs a bit of renovating. So I have a cost calculator here, which you can play around with, but it's reasonably accurate. I calibrated it with our builder, Joe, who does lots of these kind of property renovations. And typical kind of tidy up for a 3-bed semi where you're not replacing all the carpet, let's say keeping the laminate flooring in situ, and it's just general paint and decorator, maybe £4,000. So, okay, so now the property owes you £58,000. And the next question is, well, how much is it going to cost to run the property each year? And the answer is that, well, firstly, you've got to pay interest. So let's say you're foreign national. It's the best deal that I know of at the moment that's reasonable is Gatehouse Bank at 4.29%. These numbers change all the time. That's 4.29% for a 2-year fixed rate. And therefore interest rates are this. Now, if you were a UK resident, for example, then 3.2 is a number that you might see for a limited company buy to let. and therefore your profits go up a lot more. But let's keep it at 4.29%. You can change these numbers if you want to. And then we've got voids. So let's assume that the place will be empty. Now, if you're buying the right area, that there's good rental demand, then there's such huge rental demand, in fact, that you should be able to rent out a good property nearly immediately. And that means, say, you keep a tenant for 2 years, you've got 1 month void at the beginning, half a month void each year. So that's your total actual income. And then we do the numbers here, and this is the total profit after all the costs, and that's your tax, and if you're foreign national. And if you're not foreign national, then the tax treatment is kind of different, actually. So let's just do that for UK limited company. And let's just change the interest rates on that and make them 3.2 instead of 4.29. And you can see already how easy it is just to change all the scenarios. And then your profit goes up to 2.7 thousand a year. Nice. Obviously, you pay dividends on top of that, but I just didn't want to go that far down the rabbit hole because then you get all sorts of variables. So this is post corporation tax. There you go. You're getting an ROI of 5.5% on cash. That's okay as investments go. Now, the next thing is, what about the next 5 years? How's it all going to look then? And if you factor in inflation, which you should always do, then you could say that interest rates, if you look at the macroeconomic picture here, for example, the likelihood is that we're in for relatively low interest rates, relatively high inflation. And that's because government debt is very high. And in order for government debt to be reduced in real purchasing power terms, the easiest way out is to just inflate the debt away. This is very similar to the 1940s, as in post-war debt, high inflation, and actually very high house prices. So I've written about all of this in this article here, which if you're interested in macroeconomics, is well worth reading because it gives you a sense of where we are in the property cycle as well. And then we've got average inflation rates and so on. So average interest rates, should I say, and inflation rates. So I'm going to go last 5 years average interest rates, and I'm going to say last 20 years inflation because historical inflation was a bit higher. And so there we are here for this. So the point is all these variables, they'll do things, they'll adjust the numbers, which is helpful. And now we can see our cash return, inflation adjusted, you're at 5.7% a year. So that's great. And 10 years, because rent goes up, assuming interest rates don't go up, but expenses go up in line with inflation, then you make more money over time, assuming you don't refinance. Now, what about capital growth? Well, that's an interesting one, and it's a very misunderstood topic, I would say, and it's one I've really gone in deep on. I built this tool, which I'll link to in the description, and you can see here what I've done is I've looked at, I've got an explainer video. Watch the video. And it'll tell you all about it and why these numbers are actually really, really useful and good. But anyway, for this calculator, I'm using historic 5-year capital growth data. If you believe in the 18-year property cycle, you'll assume that the next 5 years are going to be roughly in line with the previous 5 years in terms of capital growth. It's only an approximation. But anyway, this area, M40, is doing relatively well. So I've done some comparisons with other areas, and you can see it's just a very strong area. So that's great. So let's say you make a sensible decision, buy a nice property in M40, and this is what you might look forward to. We're going to do a couple of scenarios. So we've got this as a scenario, but I'm going to do a worst case scenario as well in a second. And so the capital growth, well, it looks like non-inflation adjusted, it's going to go up 50%. So that means that £165,000 or let's say you do the work on the property, it's now worth 165 because you spent £4,000 on it. And in 5 years, it's probably going to be worth about 250. So you've made £85,000 in nominal growth, but if you inflation adjust it, so you've got equivalent purchasing power, in real terms, your wealth would go up by nearly £50,000. And in purchasing power equivalent terms today, that property will have gone up by around £47,000. So nice job, well done for buying an M40. Now, the next thing is we've got annualized growth, and that's just simply the number divided by 5. And you can see that in nominal terms, i.e. non-inflation adjusted, you're up 31%, and that's each year. So your ROI is 31%. You've put in nearly £58,000, and you're getting something like £17,000 back in capital gain. Why is this such a big deal? Because if you refinance and you extract the money, it's proceeds from a loan, and you don't get taxed on loans. This assumes you just keep the property ad infinitum, which you should do if it's a good asset. And then we have, so we've got some awesome figures. Now, 17% real growth if you factor in inflation. So you're 17%, 70% ROI each year on this asset, which is just very good. And this is nothing special. This is just like a 3-bedroom semi-detached house in a suburban area in a place where there's decent capital growth. And this isn't even the strongest capital growth in the country. It's just a good area. Now, the next thing is we've got a combination then of the real return. So after 5 years, you've made you've made a total income with the cash return plus the capital growth of nearly £100,000. So that's a 181% ROI over 5 years if you combine the tax and the capital gain. So I know they seem like unbelievable numbers, but they're real, assuming capital growth carries on as it has done. And that's your average return if you combine capital growth. And here's the inflation adjusted. So inflation adjusted, you're up 115%. And then you can extrapolate all the way 10 years hence. I put these numbers in just as an exercise, but I tend not to really pay attention to those. I'm just going to show you a different capital growth story very quickly. And this data is from the capital growth tables that I've pulled together. And there's a link in the description, and there's just lots of information here, and there's even a little video explainer, me explaining how it works. So all really straightforward. But I wanted to just show you the worst performing postcode district that I know of in the country, and it's probably BD1. So let's just have a look at that and see how that affects all the numbers. And here we go here. So BD1. And let's see what the capital growth numbers look like. So imagine you decided to buy a property in BD1, and you're now forecasting the growth over the next 5 years. So you say the historic capital growth to the future. Well, in this case, this area hasn't performed very well relative to other areas. And in 5 years' time, if you paid 165,000 for it, it's likely you'll see some nominal capital growth, but in reality, you're likely to lose money in real terms. So say £8,000 or £9,000 in this case would be the purchasing power reduction in value in the property. So in 5 years' time, in theory, it's worth 178, but in purchasing power terms, it's worth 156. And let's say today it's valued at 165 because you spent 4,000 improving it and you paid 160 for it. So that's the power of capital growth, and how just by making a simple decision like buying a property in the right area can have such a huge impact on your future wealth gain or loss. Now, the next thing is, let's say you buy a property and you want to flip it. Well, okay, so you need to make a bit more money on this one. So buy a bit cheaper, add a bit more value, and that's the flip scenario. And what about refinancing? So that's a great question. And let's say you refinance at 75% loan to value, which is entirely reasonable. Then if you did, then you could extract £68,000, or in today's purchasing power, in today's money, £59,000, because we're assuming a rate of inflation of X. Now, the rate of inflation, you can increase that or decrease the numbers depending on the scenario you believe in. Anyway, the point is that you're extracting nearly £13,000 annualized out of this property, which, by the way, is a lot more than than you're getting out of rent. So out of rent, I think it's around £2,000. And where's the rental return? I think it was 2,700, wasn't it? Yeah, 2,746. So that's a big return, just out of cash. Now, the next thing is you could. Okay, so the next question is, what if you want to refinance and buy another property? Well, I am going to show you a couple of examples. So this first one is based on very poor capital growth. So this is BD1. And let's say you spend a bit of money renovating it and you got some fees, some stamp duty, and so on. Then the most you could mortgage is probably around £25,000. So that isn't going to buy you a property, I'm afraid. Whoops. So let's just assume, for the sake of discussion, that we made a good decision and we bought somewhere like, as I say, M40, which is a decent postcode. It's not absolutely exceptional, but it's doing all right. So let's go back down and look at what would happen if we refinanced this property in 5 years' time. And the answer is that you could, in theory, buy a property of worth up to £213,000. So assuming capital growth carries on as is, and well, that's it. You assume if capital growth carries on the same as it has done for 5 years, but 5 years hence, and you bought an M40, then you could buy a property worth, in today's money, 186,000. Now, obviously, if you imagine all properties in that area keep going up, therefore you'll end up with a less, like, you won't be able to buy another 3-bed semi with it, but you could buy a 2-bed terraced house with it or something like that in 5 years' time. So that's the power of capital growth. And if you refinanced in 10 years, well, then you could buy, well, the numbers get a bit crazy. And so, as I said before, I tend not to pay too much attention to the 10-year growth numbers because who knows what'll happen. But if you believe in the property cycle, it's reasonably okay to assume that markets will keep going up for a while. So the next thing is, maybe you want to sell. Okay, I'm out. What am I going to get out of this thing? Well, if you cash out and you get, if you remember, if you factor in your deposit, then then that's what you would take out of it in 5 years' time. So excluding deposit. But if you decided, oh, I'll just take out the deposit as well, then we're up to 100,000. And if you cash out everything plus the rental gains, you're 115,000 up. In today's purchasing power terms, 87,000. So it's all really simple stuff when you get to understand the figures. And I hope you find that helpful. Just in summary, so yeah, I think it was a real moment of enlightenment for me when I built this thing. It took me quite a long time to build it because I wanted to get all the scenarios right and so on. I think I spent on and off maybe a month working on it between working on all my other stuff. Uh, it is an incredibly valuable tool for me and for the business as a whole. When we publish new properties and share them with the group, we're now putting all of these calculations in because I think people need to know their figures. And anyway, it's there for you to use. So I hope you find it helpful. All right. Thank you.